Hey guys, welcome to my corner of the internet. Today we're going to be doing a journey through our heels. This is my best friend Casey. I've known her since what?
14.
Yeah, so we've been friends for quite some time. This series is actually happening because this is kind of her idea, and I'm lucky to call her my friend, and she's here to do this.
Yay!
The color of your skin definitely doesn't define who you are.
Absolutely.
And you've known that about me since we met. Like, I feel like when we were in high school, it was very segregated. Like, Asians with the Asians, the goth kids, and then the jocks, and then, like, you know, there was...
Student council kids
yeah,
that were super smart, and we're going to go to Harvard.
Yeah, and then it was so cliquey. And, again, the Asians accepted me because they knew who my brother and my cousins were, but I don't think if that was the case, I would have been accepted by them. And it was funny because you and I had math together freshman year, and you were always kind to me. And I don't know. Like, I mean, I was lucky where I got along with everybody. I was friends with the jocks. I was friends with just kind of everybody, and I hung out with everybody. But I remember in senior year when you stopped sharing, you're like, I have no friends. I have no one to hang out with. I was like, wait, what do you mean? I was like, I'm your friend. I'll hang out with you kind of thing, you know? So that made me, like, really sad.
I know. Well, I will say one thing. Having that bullying background and just going through all of the times where I was fearful for my safety, fearful for just being who I was in public, and just having all that racism just attached to my identity just because of my aesthetic.
Yeah.
No child chooses their parents. We don't choose like, hey, I want to be light-skinned, thick, and super cute, and I want to have good hair.
And I want blue eyes.
And I want blue eyes, and I really want, like, every toe to be perfect. None of those weird toenails.
Yeah.
You know, just, like, really weird little things that people like to make fun of, like feet or
like
your
flaws.
earlobes. Yes.
But the flaws are what makes us us, and what
Exactly.
makes us beautiful, and I feel like God gives us flaws for a reason.
Absolutely.
But I don't see them as flaws. I find them unique and quirky, and that's what makes you you.
Beautiful imperfections.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But kind of going back to your childhood, your sister Blair.
Yes.
You guys don't look anything like, right?
We don't.
She's way lighter than you are.
Mm-hmm.
And this is tan for Casey, because in high school she was even lighter than this.
Well, again, I spent my entire time in high school cheering, being in a gym, either doing cheer practice or gymnastics practice or doing strengthening and weight training down in the basement, like a dungeon.
Yeah, it was a jail down there.
Yeah,
It
wasn't until
like
my
meat.
senior year, I think, that I actually got out of the school and went to Costa Rica with my Spanish class and had my normal color back, where I was really dark, and not dark, but I had a really, really nice warm color, which is what I was so used to in my natural habitat in Miami. I just grew up being used to that same coloring, so here I do feel very pale, and we can definitely get into a little bit later about how racism has really changed for me personally, being someone of mixed African American and a Caucasian background, and how that's really changed from when I was younger, you know, till now. But going back to my sister really quick, I have a African American mother and a Italian Irish father, and my grandmother is a first generation immigrant from Sicily. And so I have the darker hair, I've got the darker skin, and I look more Spanish or Italian or very, you know, ethnically ambiguous is what I've been called lately.
Really?
And so
the politically correct term now.
And so I've definitely been, just like you throughout my whole life, I've definitely been a floater. And I think because I experienced that racism so young, I learned that I know what it feels like to be treated badly, so I want to go forth and to find people who are treated badly, and I would constantly go and find that child who was being picked fun of, and I would go and befriend them, and I would try and bring them into my world or my circle, and just to love on them, because I knew what it was like to be discriminated against. I knew what it was like to be called names and to be, you know, just unfairly biased opinions of me, and just to deal with some things that were just really unfair as a child that should not be put on you, but that you had to deal with because of extenuating, just external circumstances.
Yeah,
things that I don't have any control over.
Right.
And so I definitely kind of started taking people in and really just loving on people and really wanting to be accepting and welcoming, which is why I have such a diverse group of people around me now. Yeah. And I just find that it's so important. And so it is interesting, though, growing up, my half-sister is a daughter from my mother who's about 6 years older than me. And we share the same mom, and we have different dads. Her dad is Scottish and Northern European, I believe. So she has blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm 5'2", and she's 5'11". I wear a size 6 shoe. She wears a size 12 shoe.
Oh, wow.
And so
Really?
we have a very large gap in, you know, just how we look, the type of fathers that we had, and just different cultures there. And it's interesting how we both had different experiences growing up, because she was really light and blue-eyed and no one really knew she was ethnic, and then I was a lot darker and definitely looked mixed. Yeah. And we had some similar circumstances but also different. And so Blair experienced a little bit of favoritism, the lighter skin, the lighter hair, the blue eyes. She was very rare. She was seen like a sparkly unicorn. And she was very beautiful. She did tan quite a bit, just naturally.
Yeah.
And so people kind of swooned over her. She was almost like the Mariah Carey of our family, where she just was so interesting and unique and different that everyone flocked to her. So she was very spoiled growing up, and people typically treated her a little bit better based on that, because she was so unique. It's kind of like seeing a rare diamond in the midst of just granite rock, and you gravitate towards that, even though you may have otherwise seen that that was different and it would have been outcast. Because it was so different and unique and beautiful, people kind of accepted her a little bit more as a young child. By the time I came around about 6 years later, obviously racism had grown a little bit further, because we're in the late 80s now, and I looked very mixed. And so with us being together, we definitely got more racism directed towards us, especially during school. They knew who our grandparents were. They knew that we had African American roots. And so I think the similarity there was that we definitely both got the racism when we were older, just because of the association of having African American, very dark grandparents. And so she definitely got some preferential treatment, and, you know, people accepted her a little bit easier because of her light skin and her blue eyes. But I'd say that as she grew up, she definitely got into the same type of racism and discrimination that we all have had.
So even though she didn't look African American, she still got bullied.
Absolutely. So by the time I was in elementary school, my sister was in late middle school, and we got horribly bullied. We got called Oreo, cow, white N-word, just really, really awful, discriminatory type of things. And she was bullied mainly because they knew who her grandma was, and that she actually was African American, even though she didn't show it. And so in the 80s, it was really interesting, and even into the 90s. Now everyone thinks that light skin, mixed, and all of this interracial coupling and dating and marriage is so cool, and it's like the thing to do, and everyone wants a mixed kid. But in the 90s, we were literally seen, as I had mentioned, as an abomination. Yeah. We were seen as this thing that was taboo. It was something that you shouldn't do. It was something that, you know, while they thought that the children were possibly beautiful, no one would ever admit that. We were seen as this thing that was kind of like the odd person out, that we just weren't welcome and wanted around. And so it wasn't even the color of your skin at that point. If you had one drop, you were black. And so it's very different from now. And I had spoken that I've experienced racism differentials between when I was young and when I'm older now. So when I was younger, I was accepted as African American. I only grew up with my African American family. I did not have my dad in my life since I was 2 years old until I was 21. And I didn't know what it was like to be anything other than African American. I was raised just like any African American kid, and I was raised by a woman who was born in 1928. And so her perspective and how she reared me as a child was very different from someone who maybe had a mom who was born in the 70s. And so I got a very eclectic mix of having my mom around sometimes, and then having my grandma being the main person really rearing me and giving me the discipline and the character, and the type of lifestyle and mindset that I had as a child was really shaped by that grandmother figure, who had dealt with a lot of racism, dealt with the Martin Luther King times where she saw things so differently. And so I was raised in an aspect that was where my mindset needed to be, and that was my focus. And so now, dealing with racism, the African Americans don't want to accept me, a lot of them. And I'm told, well, you're not black enough, or, you know, one drop isn't real, or, you know, you're light skinned and mixed, and there should be separate things for you guys, because you shouldn't even be allowed to associate with us, whether it's a competition or just even being out in society and classifying yourself as African American. They want us to have our own box, because they don't feel like we should be able to stand in united fronts with them because they're fully African American. And while we're talking about the subject, most African Americans in America are mixed with something, even if it's 5%. You are a mixed child. Because of the slave culture, and even down to our ancestors getting raped, there was a lot of intermixture of cultures and ethnicities. So African Americans have a very diverse mixture of things. Even if we're talking about mixing of different countries in Africa, we're all mixed to certain degrees. So it's been almost more damaging having grown up with the African American community, loving me and raising me and accepting me, than to come around into my 20s and 30s and have the African American community reject me. And that was very difficult because it's painful. That was my safe haven. That was my culture. Yeah. And then now to be told, well, you can't really be white because you're not quite white, but you can't quite be black because you're not black enough. And so kind of feeling like I'm just in this bubble of just being discriminated against and not being accepted by the family that I've always known.
Yeah. And
having to go back and forth between, well, where do I fit? And then kind of just curating my own group of people to be around where I felt like none of us saw color and none of us were worried about where you came from, what your citizenship status is, you know, what Ivy League did your parents come from. You know, it was more of a very natural thing where we just kind of gravitated towards each other because of our spirits and our heart. So it's definitely very damaging when you are raised in one way and society completely changes and turns over, and all of a sudden you're forced to accept a new version of reality, and it's not something you ever would have chosen for yourself. For me personally, I don't think that it's fair to tell a light-skinned person, especially one who's 30 or older, hey, you're not dark. Anybody. Let me just rephrase that. No one should be told that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So being 30 or older and being African-American and mixed and only growing up with my African-American side, it's very damaging for any person of any ethnicity, any race, any sexual preference to tell someone else, hey, you're not enough of this or you're too much of that. We should all be accepted because of our hearts and our character and who we are as people, not what we do, not where we've come from, not our ethnic background or our percentage makeup, like, oh, you're only accepted if you have 7%. How about we're just accepted because we're decent, good-hearted people? Yeah. We need to get to a place where we don't have these filters and these limitations around acceptance and just equality and love. It should be given freely within the bounds, obviously, of, you know, protecting yourself and using discernment. However, it shouldn't be based on your external circumstances and things that you weren't able to have any control over. Right. We don't have control over our parents, who our families are, what our diverse background is, what neighborhood we grow up in, you know, our shoe size, just basic things about genetics and circumstance in America. Yeah. And it's very damaging to children. It's very damaging as an adult. It's just, it gets you to a place of needing to really take care of yourself and have self-care routines and self-love. Because otherwise, if you're constantly taking in all of this external feedback, you're going to be melting under the pressure. It's just too much. Yeah. And it's hypercritical. Yeah. It's not uplifting and encouraging. No. And it's heartbreaking. And so I think we definitely need some change here. Yeah. And I believe that would really shift the atmosphere in an aspect of just love, acceptance, and diversity and equality. Yeah. Even down to how women treat each other. There needs to be some shifts. And I think as a generation, millennials have done a really good job of trying to shift the paradigms. Yeah. But there's still more work that needs to be done. And I'm so grateful for it. Yeah. And I'm glad where things are going. I really would love to see the African American community really let go of colorism. As a minority person who is mixed myself, the one thing that hurts me the most is colorism, because our ancestors didn't ask to be raped by white slave masters. Our parents didn't ask to be put in certain situations. We are who we are by choice and circumstance alone. Yeah. Not choice, excuse me. Our parents absolutely decided to get married, but back to our ancestral slavery roots.
Because my parents.
Some parents choose to be together.
Okay, I'm Asian girl.
Some are arranged, and honestly, some of that's turned out better. But others chose. Does it? If we're going back to the ancestral times where African Americans were enslaved, we didn't have a whole lot of preference and differentials around choice. It was all pretty much predestined and preordained for us, and so I definitely believe that a lot of mixed kids didn't have that ability, especially if you're 30 years or older. Yeah. And for my circumstance specifically, a lot of the mixed kids I knew in the 90s had a black father. And I told my mother, you're a unicorn, because in the 80s and even into the 90s, a lot of mixed children had black fathers. And I'm the only person to date that I know that has an African-American mom who's in their 20s or later. Definitely 30s or later. But it definitely was very rare. Everyone that I know personally has a black father. And so that was kind of an interesting dynamic, because a lot of the mixed kids that I know grew up with a white mother. And so they're different styles of rearing their children. There's different cultural influences. And so it's very different about how I act and versus what I value versus what someone who grew up with maybe a white mother might value, and how they got raised and what their mindsets and their paradigms are. It's very, very different.
Right. No, I think you're... Well, I know one person that's mixed, but his mom's black. So it's kind of like you.
Yes. But rare.
Rare.
You had to really think about it.
And I'm sitting here thinking as you're talking, I'm like, no, that's not true. Like, why are you lying? And
I don't...
it took like all that time for me to figure it out. I was like, wait, no.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so many things where, even with racism, people talk about white silence and white omission. They don't realize it because it's never been spoken, it's never been brought up to them to the point where they have to honestly sit and think about it and observe the environment and observe their cultural appropriation or the things that they've been ingrained to do since they were born, because it's ingrained in the whole of society in America.
Yeah.
And so it really takes you to pause and be mindful and to really observe your surroundings, to understand what's going on, to be open-minded and have an open heart to hearing what other people's relationships are, what their experiences are, because racism is very much alive and real today. And I think if anything, this George Floyd death and a lot of the other African American deaths that have been brought up over the last 10 years have really shed light on what we currently face as a society all around. And it's heartbreaking. It's uncalled for. There absolutely is a need in this time for social justice, and I almost had to pause there because it's so hard to breathe as a African American person of any mixture, because that could be your son, that could be your father, that could be your aunt or your uncle, it could be anybody. Sure. And I understand there's a larger ratio of African American men who are being killed, and the African American women population is not necessarily targeted as heavily. However, the effects that reverberate down through the generations from that one loss is so substantial that it literally wrecks an entire generation, an entire bloodline. It is devastating. With every fiber of your being, everyone in that family feels it. And so it is something that the community feels, the family feels.
Yeah, and it's cool to see, like, in 2020, a lot of shit's obviously been going on, but to see, like, a community come together and, like, protest and telling, like, other people how they feel, basically, because I feel like that's what protests are, and standing up and being together and being united. And it doesn't mean you have to be black. Like, it's like everybody's coming and supporting, and I think it's a beautiful thing. But I read a post earlier today. It says, I've been to all of these protests. I've been to, like, the LGBTQ protests and all these other protests. Why is it that at the Black Lives Matters protests are the only times that I've seen police with machine guns? And that was an eye-opener for me. I was like, oh shit, I never thought about that.
Yes.
So
African Americans in America are very heavily discriminated against, mainly because of fear. We were very different. We were what they saw as the opposite of white. And so that fear spawns really odd behaviors. And there's been a lot of different verbiage that's been used over African Americans since we've been brought to America against our will. And so there's just so much fear surrounding the black man that's put into propaganda, it's put into media. And so over the generations, people grow up with that feeling of African American men are dangerous. And that's absolutely a lie. African American men are no more dangerous than a white man or an Asian man or a polka dotted man, for that matter. Anybody can be dangerous. It's who you are. It's what your choices are. It's the type of mentality that you have. It's not anything based on anything that is skin deep and superficial.
Exactly.
It can be anybody and anywhere, for that matter. We talk about nice neighborhoods and how they don't have crime. Well, that's not true, because they're targeted because of their nice things. It's a lot of things that's put into the society that has created these mindsets that are toxic and people have grown up surrounded themselves with. Just like when little girls in the 80s and 90s grew up seeing these beautiful airbrushed figures,
Barbie
models and runway models, lingerie models, whoever it was, and didn't realize until I think the early 2000s that they were airbrushed, and that's not real. But it took a revolution and it took an awakening for people to come out in the industry and say, hey, this isn't real. I don't want a little 6-year-old or a 12-year-old being bulimic because she feels like she's not beautiful. There's something very wrong with this. And so I think that's where we are with the African American protests now. And I know a big thing that has been talked about is all lives matter. And I think what upsets the African American community about that is they believe that until we are all equal and seen as equal and given equal rights, and there aren't these stereotypes that, subconsciously really play into how people treat African Americans in particular, that everyone can't be equal. And so saying all lives matter, well, yes, all lives do matter, but it's if that statement is true, all lives matter, how is it then that we are persecuting African American men brutally in the street like they were animals without value or worth?
Right.
without a second thought. And no one's stepping up to protest or to stand up against it while these acts are occurring. And that's mostly because of fear as well. Fear of retribution, fear of discipline.
Yep.
And unfortunately, you do have dirty people out there, no matter what field you're in, who will make it seem a certain way at any cost just so that they look right.
Right.
And that's where, obviously, the accountability comes in, where we're needing some reform throughout the government and different social programs.
Okay, so I'm going to play a little bit of bad cop because I have a lot of friends that are either Republican, Democrats, whatever, like, what is it, undefined?
Independent.
Independent.
Third party. Green party.
No, I don't give a shit. No, I'm just kidding.
Any kind of party.
Yeah, whatever. But, a lot of Republicans and, like, I don't want to say white privilege, but they are Americans. They have the white skin,
Absolutely.
the blue eyes, and they're like, well, if you never wrote fraudulent checks, would you have been pinned down? Or if you weren't doing these illegal things, A, B, C, D, E, is that right? Yeah. I was like, did I say my alphabet right? Would the officer have stopped this African American man?
Absolutely.
So, what do you think about that?
Let's start taping every time a white person commits a crime. Let's start pinning them down in the streets. Let's see how they like it. That's a really crappy way to say that, but let's turn the tables and let's treat the Caucasian population the same way that the African American population is treated, and let's see what they have to say about it at that point. Yeah. Because until you've walked 2 miles in my moccasins, 2 miles in my shoes, you
2 miles in my heels.
2 miles in my heels. I'm so sorry. 2 miles in my heels.
Yeah.
Until you've walked 2 miles in our heels, you don't have the right to tell us what we've been through, who we are, what we deal with on the daily basis. So if you never understand as a white Caucasian American what it's like to be Asian, what it's like to be African American, any ethnicity that is a minority, then you don't honestly understand what it feels like and what the reality is of living that day to day. You gloss over it, you don't even see it because it's not part of your reality and part of your day-to-day life until you are confronted with it, or someone that you love so deeply that it literally shakes you to your core. Yeah. Only then will you truly be able to understand what we're going to. Absolutely. Are there African American people, men, women, children, who have committed crimes? Absolutely. I think we're all in agreement of that. But how is that any different from any other race?
Right.
There are Asians,
everybody commits
Caucasian,
crime.
Mexican,
all races.
All races.
Like, wait,
I'm trying to be relevant because we got this thing going. But anybody.
Yeah, the color of your skin doesn't determine if you're gonna make do crime or if you're gonna be smart. Like, we have all of these stereotypes, right? And I think someone said to me one day, "You're lucky for being Asian," and I said, "Excuse me, what?" They're like, you guys have all the good stereotypes. Like, you guys are nerdy, you guys are smart, you're good at math, blah, blah, blah. The only bad stereotype you have is for the guys, and you don't have a dick, so why do you care? And I was like, oh, I guess, I never saw it that way because I am Asian and I crack all the stereotype jokes, but I guess because all the stereotypes for Asians are good, I always kind of found them funny, but then now that I think about it and I think about all the stereotypes for African Americans, they're not. It's like, you guys sell drugs, or you guys are only successful if you're a drug dealer or an athlete.
Or a pimp.
Yeah, like all of these things, like being an athlete, great, you worked your ass off to get there, you
Absolutely.
know what I mean? But it's like all of the other stuff is like degrading, and that's sad. Like, that stereotype is so sad because I kind of grew up in the hood and all my black friends were great. And
Absolutely.
even like growing up in white suburbia, I still don't see color, but even all my black friends, they're still great. One of my best friends is half black, part black, you know what I mean? Like, it's, to me, that's kind of what's crazy, is that we as a society and as a culture dive in and believe these stereotypes.
Absolutely. And again, I don't think that is social preference. I believe that it is so deeply ingrained in society that it honestly is really hard to separate yourself from, because you grew up seeing things and hearing things and watching movies. It's as easy as putting it in a Disney film. There weren't
100.
really black princesses. And so you don't have anything that's really honoring your culture and your background, because it's not even out there and being represented in each of the fields or in each of the entertainment areas as well.
Yeah.
And I think the most interesting thing for me is watching your In Your Heels episode and hearing how you're Korean and how you dealt with a lot of the things that I dealt with as a mixed woman. Yeah. And probably similar to a woman who's from India or a woman who's Mexican, just feeling the same type of things. There's that commonality in that. And there's that thread that connects us all. So while we're so different in our cultural aspects, we're all very similar in what we've experienced and been through.
Oh, I totally
There's
agree.
definitely some common threads there. And I think that's really awful that we've all been through some horrible things, but I do believe that there's beauty in the relativity of it.
Yeah. And it makes us stronger, and it makes us who we are today. And I remember a while ago you were crying to me, and you know, you're just like, I'm just so tired, like, da-da. And I was like, but look at who you are today. You're such a beautiful, strong, independent, like, badass bitch. Like, and I wouldn't have you any other way. Like, you're like, but I could do this and I could do that. I'm like, no, you are perfect the way you are. And honestly, I hope you see how perfect you are. So, you know, we would hug, but COVID. We're as like we're not even
social distancing.
Yeah, we're like not social distancing, but I don't have COVID because all I do is sit at home.
Me too.
Yeah.
Working 14 hours a day, designing, and having a really nice time giving back, making masks for folks.
Yep. She like made a few for like my family too, and they're super cute. But is there anything else you want to share about like kind of like with the Black Lives Matters and like your childhood?
There's a lot we could talk about. There's so many issues with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And
but something
I don't know if you allow comments, but we definitely could take some questions and commentary and be able to try and give some feedback to that. Obviously be kind, you know.
If you say anything mean about my friend, I will block you. Period. No mean comments. I don't want the comment section to be negative and nasty. Like, that's not the reason for my channel. Like, we're here to uplift each other and share our stories. So if you have a mean thing to say, keep it to yourself or I will block you.
Absolutely.
Period.
And I think even as your channel, doing something so bold and so raw and vulnerable, it takes a lot of courage to do this. And I think it's incredible that you've done this. I think it's going to be amazing to watch these different women and the stories that they have and their testimony in life. Just kind of what we've walked through and how we've come out stronger and how we're still standing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things in life, no matter what color you are, no matter what your beliefs are, you know, religious-wise or your sexual preference, we all have so many different things that we have to deal with every day that we have to overcome and persevere through. And life is tough.